So now to continue my train of thought, I go in a few different directions. I get a little excited. The idea of directing attention to positives is, as I said, it's altogether absent in Dianetics, which is based entirely on finding and processing painful experiences. And I don't want to sound like I'm picking on Dianetics, because as I said, there's a lot of wonderful things that happen in Dianetics, and some of my PCs that actually process things to the highest levels and blow things by inspection most easily are my PCs that got hundreds and hundreds of hours in Dianetics. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, I've got quite a few of these PCs that accomplished actually pretty amazing things by running those hundreds of hours of Dianetics, and are so beautifully set up now for positive processing, which is what they're really hungry for after all of that. Okay, so anyway, to continue with that, the theory on which Dianetics is based is that a person can be restored to their full functioning potential that way. Dianetics can certainly bring about great results for many people, but the processing of negative experiences while bringing great relief and resolving many unwanted feelings, sensations, and false perceptions does have its limitations. The incidents of being forcibly overwhelmed, which are what Dianetics and other negatives-based processing addresses, contain a moment of shock. From L. Ron Hubbard's Professional Auditors Bulletin, in Scientology we abbreviate Professional Auditors Bulletin, PABS. If you hear somebody say PABS, that's more Scientology's. Professional Auditors Bulletin, number 80 of April 17th, 1956. They come in many forms. They've been reprinted many times as the Church of Scientology recycles materials to resell them to people. Here's one volume of the Professional Auditors Bulletins, or PABs. And this is from, book 4, this was March 1956 to November 1956. They've probably republished this in different forms 4 or 5 times since this, which is from the 70s. Anyway, quoting from Professional Auditors Bulletin number 80, "What is this new discovery?" And again, I'm quoting Hubbard's words, "more important than pain and unconsciousness." Quoting Hubbard's words. That can be stated as the moment of shock, that period of realization that an overwhelming has occurred. So overwhelming, what we mean by overwhelming is being completely dominated by the force of something, okay? Right here, we have Ron Hubbard, the writer and author of Dianetics, telling us that 6 years after the Dianetics book came out, 6 years later, saying he's just discovered something more important than the basis of Dianetics as it was known then, more important than pain and unconsciousness, the moment of shock. Isn't that interesting? Now, mind you, Hubbard never did follow up on this discovery with a technique for fully processing that moment of shock. This is very important in relation to positives. I'm going to explain this. Despite its enormous importance, this moment of shock, okay, when you consider that, by Hubbard's own words, this single item, this moment of shock, overshadows the basic subject of the book of Dianetics, Incidents of Pain and Unconsciousness. The closest Hubbard came to processing the moment of shock that I've discovered, and this is not only in my own research, but other people sharing theirs with me, was that for handling an illness, one technique for part of handling an illness was to spot the exact time and place of a shock that occurred prior to an illness. We call this in Scientology dating and locating. It's a very specific procedure for spotting the exact moment and the exact location, the exact point in time, the exact point in space of an occurrence, in this case is shock. But this did not fully process the entire content of the shock. It did relieve or key it out, at least for the moment. But there is much material in a shock that isn't processed that way, and Hubbard never did evolve a technique or release a technique to fully process out the content of a moment of shock. Now going back to what I've covered about beingness, identity, who or what we conceive ourselves as being, is havingness of space. which again is very true. It's not just the volume of space, but what emanations or energies the being permeates that space with, as well as the volume of space that the being occupies. Now, theoretically, a being's space can be virtually infinite, or as small as a tiny dot. The very concept of space implies quantities or volumes of space, limitations. Now, here's the thing. A shock always has the effect, and this might even be the best description of a shock, is that it's a collapsing of the person's space. A shock always has a collapsing of the being's space. Okay? And therefore, conceptually, as we define beingness as havingness of space, that's a collapse of the being as they conceive themselves. Now, this can be demonstrated by using a couple of steps from Alan Walter's shock handling, which is quite brilliant and does process the content of a shock. Just have yourself or have a person think of a moment of shock and then ask these two questions. How big were you before the shock? And then, how big were you after the shock? And inevitably, always, the answer to the second question, how big were you after the shock, is always going to be smaller. Okay? I mean, in every common day human expression, you hear, making another person feel small. Those concepts of the amount of space occupied is related to beingness, even among us who never studied any particular discipline such as Scientology. Expressions like, that's mighty big of you, or that was really big of you, or, he's really being very small. I mean, these concepts of size are very, very endemic to existence in a physical universe. And so with each of our engram experiences, the negatives we accumulate diminish the self because they contain the moment of shock. Okay? The collapsing of one's space and thus your very beingness. And this is what we need to reverse. Not merely erase, as we do in Dianetics. We erase engrams. But we need to reverse the collapsing. What we want to do, again, we talk about infinity of spirit. We see this diagram here. It expands outward and upward. That's what we want to do as beings. And that's where positive processing comes in. So even after handling the collapsing of a shock, at that moment, it's very important to then positively process the person on something that gets them expanding and becoming bigger. One way I took this up recently with one person, we had very limited time. Somebody who was referred to me by another auditor because this person wasn't available to be processed in person. So another well-known auditor in the field who does not audit remotely asked me if I could help this person. And it turned out the only way this person was available was over phone, and only for a very small, limited amount of time. So I'm happy to help anybody. I'll give anybody 1 or 2 free sessions who really, feels there's something they really need help with. I do at least a couple of free sessions every week. I'm happy to do it. And, put that idea in your pocket in case you ever need it. I really am happy to do it. So anyway, in this occasion, what this other colleague had in mind was to run this person on power processing. But when I spoke with him, you've always got to just find out what the person needs by what they have to say. I don't think you should ever go into a session with a concrete plan. You've got to process the person in front of you based on where they're at this moment, not anything preconceived. So you do go in with a plan, but you need to be flexible. The session's for the pre-clear. So when I spoke with this person over the phone, they started describing something which, from my background and experience, I recognized as moments of shock. And I checked that with this person. Are you stuck in or experiencing a moment of shock? And get a very fast yes. So I did the shock handling with this person over the phone. It worked quite well, but he had a limited amount of time. he needed to have his win, end the session, and get off the phone, and we were not going to have time to do much more processing due to his particular situation. Otherwise, I would have liked to run a positive process on him, because he was very collapsed, very collapsed. This person had at one time a thriving, huge business. This person had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars at Flag, getting just pummeled downward and downward by overrunning L's processes, because they wanted to use up all the money on his account. And even over his protest, the situation was that he was just, just hammered with more and more ineffectual, pointless L's processing. This is not a criticism of L's, it's a criticism of anything of how they were misapplied. And so I've observed from several different PCs that I've repaired that L's can be misrun and have a very horrible effect. That's why one of the people I recommend is Trey Lotz, and one or two other people. Very, very choosy who you go to for L's. They can be fabulous. Anyway, this person had really been collapsed. The particular thing that happened in an L session, okay, that shouldn't have been done. And we ran out the shock, and he felt an enormous amount of relief, as he should. And, he's like on a win and needed and wanted to just, okay, go out and have his win and let that fully unfold for him. You never want to just bypass a win with more negative game processing. Big mistake. PC will protest, hopefully. Anyway, what I could do for the person, since we had to end session, I had him do a life process. I said, okay, he had told me all the things, how restricted he'd felt. He could barely get out of the house he was in. That was his boundary. He could barely communicate with anyone. He felt completely debilitated from anything he wanted to do or should have been doing. And the only calm line he basically had was with somebody who had completely rejected him. So I said, what I want you to do after this session, is go out. I want you to do things you've been afraid to do, that you've limited yourself from doing. I want you to go into spaces that you felt you couldn't get into before. I want you to expand get your dimension points and your anchor points out. Okay, I want him to expand back outward. And so I gave him directions to go out of that house and across the town and do a few things he told me he had felt unable to do and felt he should have been doing. I told him, I want you to get active in all these areas. I want you to see what you're capable of doing now and get back out there and do it. And I checked with him a few days later, and he was unauditable. He was on such a big win at that point. He said, I as caved in as he'd been, he lost all his money, he lost his business, he lost his marriage and his family, he lost his home. He was staying in somebody else's place out of their generosity, feeling completely unable to do anything. And I gave him these directions, and he told me all the things he was doing. He was getting his life going. He was in communication with people and activities and things, and he was on too much of a win. I said, what would you like to process now? He says, I don't really have anything bothering me. I can't think of anything. And it wasn't just because we ran out the shock. It was because we then expanded him back outward as a being from the collapse. That's the point of positive game processing. Okay? That's what you really want, those abilities and activities and states of being that are your goals. Your goal isn't to, not feel the pressures and the pains. They're just getting in the way of what you really want. Okay? This is, I could do this if not for that. It's the do this part that we really want to process. Okay? I'm probably going pretty long here, huh? I don't know. Okay. Well, anyway, that was the greater result, was the positive gain aspect. So, as I said about what is processing, ideally we would process each experience as it happens in our life, not need the context of an auditing session to feel that we can focus on it and not be overwhelmed by whatever particular experience it is, but just to fully experience life as it happens would be the ultimate in what we might call negative gain processing, is for it never to accumulate from resisting, but experiencing it fully right there at the moment of occurrence. Now, with positive gain processing, this was an example of applying that same thing, as opposed to conceptually, envision yourself being able to do this and envision yourself doing that, and grant yourself that energy and feel it and experience it, which is very valid, and I'm going to go into how I do that. But just in this case, what the situation called for, and we needed to do more for this guy. So that was the solution. All right, step out of that, go beyond that sidewalk and beyond that block and across town and experience your expanded beingness and get your anchor points and your dimension points back out there. And that created a big change for this person. He told me when we spoke after that he no longer felt the desperate need to get rejected communication from a person who had rejected him anymore. Because that was his happiness level, that was his acceptance level as a collapsed being. That the level of communication he could have was like, you aren't okay. That was the acknowledgement that that was having this for him. Okay, so we got him up to the point way beyond that, where he said, boy, I've stopped doing that, I don't need that anymore, and we have an expanded being. That's what we want, okay? The positives. Now, I'll explain how I'm applying this, and again, largely what I'm using comes from a lot of sources. It comes from what Ron Hubbard shared, it comes from what Alan Walter shared. I should also acknowledge a good friend and mentor, Roger Baswarva, who is the Johnny Appleseed of knowledgeism as far as I'm concerned, and of his own applications and expansions on Alan Walter's knowledgeism. And so there are various sources. I mean, my way is to go to the gist of whatever is available that I find for what resonates with me as a being and as a processor, to recombine with other ideas, my own ideas and procedures, to do whatever I think is going to be most effective for the people that I'm processing. And I believe that the greatest ability is to keep your mind open and never to fall into any one particular paradigm or any one particular person's way. Just stay away from the word the idea that anything is the singular way to do something, or the solution, or the cause of all aberration. Because our case is however we envision it, it's however we create it, and whatever approach resonates with you, that's the path you should be taking now. That's the approach you should be doing, whatever that is. And so we want to stay away from fixed ideas and single sourcing anything. Okay? The greatest ability I'm finding, and I'm very pleased with the results I'm getting, because I'm finding that one for one, everybody that I'm processing is coming back and not only telling me how different their life is out of session, but the people around them are noticing how much more capable and how much more able and how much higher level that person's operating on. What we want is beyond conceptual real life results, changes in operating basis, changes in ability. That's what we really want. And so whatever resonates with you, but it's very important, I think, to be open to the idea of change. I truly hope to change my mind about everything I just said here and learn even greater truths. And how I got to this is by having that idea about the things I used to accept, which were more limited. I at one time was, if it's got Ron Hubbard's name on it and he says it, you've got to be an idiot to argue with that or not to accept it. A lot of people, think that way because there is so much greatness in there, but we are best served by judging each idea, each concept individually, not judging it right or wrong because of the source, or finding a way to frame it as being right so that we can have our paradigm, or having to frame other things as being wrong because they're a threat to our paradigm. If you don't accept the idea that you need fixed solutions, then the sky's the limit. Okay? So
we need appropriate solutions, not fixed ones.
Exactly. And what's appropriate is what's appropriate for
this person.
Each of us individually, right, exactly. And there's a time element too, what's appropriate for you now. I mean, there is the idea among many Scientologists that you go clear and then you have virtually no case that you're responsible for. It all comes from other entities, And if that resonates with you, then you will successfully process all your case that way. God bless you. Then it will work. Dennis Stevens said it very well, that case takes on the appearance we expect it to take. So, sometimes we're indoctrinated into a certain approach. And if that rings true with us, and we like that, and we accept that, then we'll be able to process everything for as long as that paradigm is what we accept. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I have processed and continue to process many people who clear OT3, solo knots completion. I know not everybody who sees this video is going to know what these terms mean, but they're various considered levels or states of spiritual achievement in terms of Scientology. What I'm saying is, regardless of what level they might be on the grade chart and what the supposed truths are, I've processed many people who were OT3, solo knots completion, whatever, on identities and on shocks and on incidents, but always going with what resonated for the person. I don't say, that's a shock, you have a moment of shock. But I will say, is there a moment of shock there? And if the person says yes, which they almost always do, because I know what I'm perceiving, then we have something to process. Some people do not process things. They don't envision things that way. We create through what we envision. Some people envision it as all engramic incidents. Some people envision it as I said, entities, discorporate beings or entities or spirits, because in Scientology, for one thing, that's very much at a certain level promoted as that's where it all comes from. If that's how you create and envision your case, it will process extremely well. I've processed things that way. For me, it happens not to be my overall, I don't have an overall approach. I don't have a uniform one-size-fits-all about anything. But, some people, I have pre-clears. Most of them do brilliantly well on processing identities. One or two, I have a couple. Interestingly, I'm sure there's a correlation here. I can think of a couple of PCs that do extremely fantastically well in session, but they do not particularly process as entities. A couple of them don't. From my PCs who have had hundreds and hundreds of hours of Dianetics since the early 1960s, or the PCs that have had L's, in the old days, like maybe the 1970s, before processing became so much less reliable in the church, when it became more compromised by the profit motive, okay? And so there are some PCs who don't process as identities. No, I don't have any identities. I don't have any identities in relation to that. That's fine, You process the case that resonates with the pre-clear the way they are currently creating their case. Again, the word currently is very important. At this time, what is real to the PC? What is on their mind? What is their file clerk presenting? Or what goals do they have right now? And you process that with what resonates for them. It's really very simple once you have enough knowledge and experience of the variety of ways in which a case can be created and therefore discreated, deconstructed, uncreated. And that's where positives is very important, because if you think about it, this is the major dichotomy of spiritual existence or processing, is the positives and the negatives, creating and uncreating, creation and discreation, positives and negatives, goals versus charge. What is charge? Charge is actually the accumulation of resistance to one's goals. So do you process the charge or the goals? You process what the person presents. If they're talking about goals, you process goals. If in processing the goals, charge comes up, then you need to shift gears and process the charge. You stay with the person. This is the exact opposite of how auditors are trained. In Scientology's, that's called changing with the pre-clear. It's called Q&A, and it's considered very bad form. And that's what I do. I wish you could hear Tatiana. She's silently laughing. I'm what they call a squirrel. I violate all the rules. I just do what's going to be best for the pre-clear. That's my only rule, as best I know it to be. So I don't claim to have all the answers. We're all still learning.